Welcome to the FYI on Youth Ministry, a youth ministry podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. This season is all about the 7 transitions that young adults go through. And in this episode, we're talking about the relating transition. I'm your host, Roslyn Hernandez, and for today's episode on the relating transition, the young adults that we'll hear from are Raechel, Raye, Amalia, Seth, Esteban, Laura, and Ethan. But first, here's Steve with an overview of the relating transition.
All right, so let's talk about the relating transition. One of the ways that we can think about the relating transition is putting it this way. Who do I trust with my past, present, and future relationships? You know, young adults are in a unique time in their lives where they're negotiating old friendships and new friendships, old relationships and new relationships. And this negotiating is really, really important because I think what they're realizing is there are some friendships and relationships that they want to continue. They even want to invest in more deeply. And so they're thinking about that. There are other relationships, perhaps with friends, even family members, where they want to put up a bit more of a barrier. They see the end of that relationship, or maybe there's something unhealthy that they are beginning to notice that they want to create a boundary for. And so that's part of what they're thinking about. A lot of times they're moving into new spaces, so they're trying to find new communities and new friendships, while oftentimes maintaining some of the older friendships as well. So as you can see, there's a lot that goes on for young adults to maintain, explore, challenge, renegotiate the relationships that they have with family and friends and those in their community.
As Steve mentioned, young adults are starting to negotiate how they want to continue their relationships. The thing is that in our day and age, relationships don't just happen, quote unquote, in real life. Having an online presence also affects how young adults change and how their relationships change. Here is Raechel reflecting about what she has learned through the internet about social issues around the world and how her faithful response to what she learned has impacted her personal, local relationships.
I think social media can be something that's super distracting or like something as an escape, or it could be something that you can use to intentionally engage and find different communities, right? What's been interesting has been like engaging in social media with different communities or information that I wouldn't really get anywhere else. There started to become kind of like a tension. Specifically for me, it was regarding Palestine. I was like, wow, this is really tugging a lot of my heart for humanity. And the conversations that I would have with some of my friends were like, oh, that's so interesting that you care about this. Like, it's really hard for me to connect to something that feels so distant from me. What challenged me was to engage with people intentionally, to kind of create a community where we bring it to the table, literally, because we've been hosting engagement dinners and different events of saying like, come learn, come engage, come pray. But we try to do it in an honoring way that doesn't feel so divisive. And we also try to do it in a way that brings a little bit more context and questions to the table.
As some young adults go into higher education, they learn more about the world, they start changing as individuals, and some of their interests change as well. Some of these changes might make it difficult to keep relating to people from their past. After starting a marriage and family therapy program, Raye learned to be more open about himself. This is how that has changed the way he relates to others.
It became clear as I started working through a lot of my stuff that the way I was relating was starting to become very distinct from a lot of the systems and norms that have been set up in the past. And so there's a personal side, I think, for myself where it's like, oh, like I'm just a very integrative person. I want all of my friends to just know and talk about anything. And I think that's gotten me in a lot of trouble in a sense of bringing up very weighty things when others may not be ready or able to. And so there's been this process of recognizing how to approach with sensitivity, wisdom, and discernment. There's a personal side of wanting to share and balancing this line of making sure I'm not coming from a place of fear where I'm disconnecting myself because I want to be seen and I want to be connected with friends. I will say that's been a long and ongoing process, and a lot of knots I feel like I'm still working out in my relationships, from current relationships and even past relationships that I'm relearning how to relate.
I love that. I think it's if I can describe it, it's like how do you connect the things that you're passionate about or that are on your mind without it being something that you push on somebody around you, right? I've had friends who have said, "Oh, I don't know that much about these different topics," or you've given me food for thought, and I'll come to this event because I know you and I don't really know anything about this topic, but because you're passionate about it, we have that relational equity, and so I'll come and learn. And then I've had friends who said like, I'm really glad that you're doing this. I'm not interested at this time. Like, thank you, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's all right. It's the thing that we're all trying to balance. It's like, how do you balance your own personal stuff and your life things while not overwhelming somebody else, but also the different like depth of your relationship also means that you do blend your life with others, and how much you share with others depends on how vulnerable you can be, or how much how much you can share and how much you can receive.
As Raye and Raechel mentioned, sometimes relationships hinge on how much young adults feel they can share with others as their own identity and as their own interests are changing. But other times, relationships change for more practical reasons, like moving. Here's Amalia's reflection on long distance friendships.
I feel like a lot of times people assume that young adulthood is about growth. It's about like gaining more. But there's also a moment of loss in losing your connection with friends just because you're changing and because they may be changing. And you may be thinking about things in a different light that maybe they haven't thought about before. So I know in my own life, dealing with relational loss, that was a huge thing I wasn't prepared for. It was something that I just didn't know about. And so in my particular instance, it wasn't conversations or it wasn't identities that were shifting. It was just distance. And so that distance created relational loss because some friends, frankly, may not be able to keep a relationship the way that I would want them to keep a long distance relationship. And so there was a tremendous amount of loss in navigating those relationships and just having to understand how they change.
Although a lot of relational transitions are about relationships with other people, young adults might also find their roles in particular spaces or communities shifting. Here's what Seth and Raechel shared about this.
I think to me it has been connected to identity of like, I think in your 20s you are discovering who you are, but as you strengthen or change your own identity, then your role with your different relationships then changes. And so like for me, it's been like, what's my relationship to church, and what's my relationship to my family and to my friends? It is really hard because that growth does come with loss and mourning. And like, people prepare you or tell you about, oh, like you're going to have all these friends get married and like how exciting that is. But like one thing that people didn't prepare me for, just recently, I've had a lot of friends get divorced, and like, I knew about wedding season, but what about divorce? Like that's a loss. And just even think about, my relationship with my family and how, being the one who's educated by my family to now I'm playing a role of education with my family, and we're having these really difficult discussions. Like as that core identity shifts, the ripple effects of that, I think, rubs off on other people, and it comes with a lot of joys and excitement, but it also comes with it continues to shape and question that core identity of who you are and how you show up in each of those places.
I think some of those transitions or like those relational aspects are also like not in our control, right? Like sometimes it is just like maybe your friend leaves the church that you were a part of, or your family member, like Seth, you were saying, like somebody gets divorced and you're like, oh, actually, because of my relationship with this person, I am no longer in relationship with this other person. And to kind of grieve that loss or kind of recognize like, oh, this is not like where we were in the past is also like this whole process.
While some relational changes feel like they are out of a young adult's control, young adults might also be using their growing agency to change the ways that they were taught to relate. Here's Esteban's reflection about how he has changed the way that he thinks about socializing and about romantic relationships.
So one thing that I've kind of figured out was I realized that I was pretty sheltered at home, and I will say that there's no hate in my heart. By the way, when I talk to my parents, I love my parents. They love me. They're still there. Like they're supporting. I will say that them being pastors influenced a lot, like a lot of how I grew up. There are things from my childhood that could have been different that would have really helped me, especially in my career field. I was really sheltered from hanging out with friends, really. Like if it wasn't from like church. So my church was only like 30. There's only like maybe five youth. So that really took a toll on me because my career field is heavily based on networking and socializing with people. It's pretty tough for me because I just never really socialized. I mean, socializing is just one area, but I can tell you maybe of like even having relationships. Like the moment I told my parents I had a girlfriend, my dad was already talking to me about marriage, and I was about to be 18. I actually started praying to God about it, and I feel like that really isn't how the world actually works. Like you don't just meet one girl and then you're like, hey, I'm gonna get married to you, so let's start thinking now, planning it after, a month or so. So things, little things like that I've just been noticing, and catching on. And
Taking a step into married life also brings a negotiation in a young adult's relationship to their own self. Here's what Laura shared about this.
So my husband and I just celebrated our first wedding anniversary like a few weeks ago. Who knows what name will be on a package that I'm getting in the mail? Like it might be my maiden name, it might be my current name. But yeah, it's been hard to like release that because your name is like part of your identity for so long. I didn't completely get rid of it. I put my last name in my middle name, and my husband did the same. But it feels different. It's been an adjustment for both me and my husband, trying to know, okay, where is this balance of I am still myself and my own person, but also my actions no longer only affect myself. And that's been like kind of a like harder, more stumbling transition into that.
While some young adults are finding their way in the early stages of marriage, like Laura, other young adults who are a little bit further on the journey get to reflect on some of the ways that they stumbled through the early years of marriage or of parenting. Here's what Ethan learned about misconceptions people might place on their spouse, their nuclear family, or even their friendships.
I think we saw a lot of people get married, especially young, and then try to pretend that their spouse could fulfill all their social needs, which is a silly notion that Christians sometimes believe. But it's also true in parenting is that this nuclear family unit is all that matters. Like one of the challenging things in there is trying to figure out who will just naturally not feel comfortable in your transition. We do a lot of pretending around friendship stages. One of the big ways of pretending is to act like no one understands when you become a parent what it's like. I was amazed by the number of people who were single, who were married without kids, who were divorced, who didn't find our transition into parenthood to be prohibitive of their friendship with us. But the other way of pretending is to pretend it makes no difference at all. And as much as we'd like to say, oh, it's all going to be the same. I mean, there's like bedtime now. The question we asked, at least over the past couple of years as our kids are older, has been like, What would be rhythms of friendship that you would want to say yes and stay saying yes to? And then let's stay curious about that and evaluate it.
Here's the advice that Amalia, Seth, Raechel, and Laura shared with us.
I mean, I know something that was meaningful for me, and this sounds so weird. I was doing a grief class, and I was there with all these like people that had lost loved ones, and I hadn't necessarily lost anyone, but I was just there because I had lost so many different like relationships. In my perspective, I feel like church leaders could do a really good job of just helping young adults grapple with those losses, either through small groups or through series or different things, just to show that grief and loss is a normal thing and it's acceptable within a church setting.
One thing that comes to mind is like almost a difference between empathy versus like comparison. If I'm talking to someone who's older than me and has more wisdom, them saying, I've had a lot of issues with my family, and here's some of the things that made me feel. What does that look like for you? That is like, I'm connecting with their emotions, they're empathizing with me, and they're inviting a response versus like, oh yeah, I went through the same exact thing, and here's what it looked like. That kind of shuts down. And there's nothing wrong with injecting your own kind of personal experience, but when that becomes the focus, it can really invalidate and devalue what someone is sharing. Like just putting it back on, I want to understand what you're going through and I want to have empathy here. I'm not trying to compare or just like give you a solution, because the solutions can be hard to find. And so empathy is the best solution in my opinion.
One of my mentors was like, you don't have to do it like under the church or something like that. Like you are the body of Christ. And so you organizing or you engaging and creating different channels or different ways to engage is also being an extension of the larger body of Christ. And that you creating those communities or those spaces with others like is part of being a community. Just because they transition to a different community or space or a different church or a different group of friends or something like that, it doesn't mean that it has to be like a rough transition. It can also be an honored transition or a blessing to continue to go forth and be the larger, extension of the body of Christ and say like, they're still family and we get to call them brother and sister now. And they get to go do something else that we get to support and see.
I would give advice to the newly married person to have grace on themselves, because this is a natural change. It's not a like failure in your like friendships that you are spending more time with your new spouse. I think I would also give the same advice to those friends who are single. Celebrating your friends doesn't have to mean that you're negating the like sadness of how things aren't going to be how they used to. You can start to now find a like new aspect to your friendship. At least when I was single, I could get really like hard on myself and like overthinking like, should I be asking them to hang out? Should I not? They're newly married, but just kind of trusting that your friend is still your friend and your friendship is still meaningful. For older adults who are walking alongside someone who is newly married or someone who is going through a relational transition, I think like the most important thing is to actively listen and acknowledge the joy and also like the pain that they might be feeling, and to normalize that, especially if it's early on in young adulthood, because those like first few friends that get married, that is such a like shock to the system because you're not used to this. Being able to honor what that person is feeling, and also encouraging them that just because there's change doesn't mean that it only has to be like a negative change, but helping to see the beauty in like what is going to now become of their relationships.
Volunteers are essential for your ministry, but finding and retaining good volunteers can be a challenge. We know. Join our online training event and we'll equip you with quality, research-based tips and tools from FYI experts on recruiting, training, and retaining youth ministry volunteers for discipleship impact. The training will take place on Tuesday, September 24th, and you can register and find more information at fulleryouthinstitute.org/volunteer. And now, here is my wrap-up conversation with Steve. Welcome back to our wrap-up conversation with Steve. Yay! Okay, so we talked about, the young adults.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about it yet. The young adults talked about relating. We hope that you found some really helpful things in there. But now we're going to go into more of the wider range that we found from the stories from relating in the research. So what else came up in the research?
Yeah, so relating is a pretty broad concept, right? And it has some different aspects to it. But from our research, remember, we looked at people in their 20s up to age 29. So what you have happening there is we know that young adults are delaying marriage or getting married later, but still some were married.
Yeah.
And so I think this relating concept wasn't just about like their friends or even their family of origin. It was about stepping into new relationships of being married. I remember one particular conversation where this individual was talking about, like, I'm married and now we're trying to find friends as a couple and I like one of the partners but not the other. And what do you do about that?
Yeah.
And so, right, so this relating dynamic becomes this really interesting thing where I'm no longer myself, but now I'm trying to think about the communities that I'm created in the new maybe status that I have being married. Some have become parents, and so they had to take on that role of what does it mean for me to be a parent to my child as I relate to others. And so I think those are really significant ones there as well. I think another one that we saw repeatedly that I find fascinating is that a lot of them lamented being ghosted by good friends.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, they talked about these stories of being really, really close in maybe high school or college, but then they graduated, they moved, they got doing other things, and all of a sudden, like, there was just non-communication anymore, and it brought a lot of pain. And as I've reflected on that, I wonder if, like, they didn't have the experience, or it was a new experience to know of how do I end a relationship or name what was good, but now we're in a different season, which gets to an interesting part of this relating transition of it being about negotiating, like what in relationships do I want to continue to invest in? Which ones am I ending for celebratory reasons? Or as I mentioned before in the intro, this idea of a boundary, because we see some unhealth that now I'm older and maybe more aware of myself to realize that that's been painful as well. So there's this constant negotiation happening of where am I investing my relational time and with whom, and is it okay for me to do that? Which often leads to some really deep conversations that have to be had as one takes ownership of the relating that they're doing in their lives.
Yeah, I think something that was interesting to me about some of what I read in the research was how parental relationships or even familial relationships influence how you see yourself in relationship to others. So when you mentioned, some of them became parents, some of them got married and became parents.
Yeah.
They think about how their parents parented them.
Right.
And that makes them question, what kind of parent am I going to be?
Right.
Or when they're grieving the loss of a grandparent or an uncle or a family member that they really loved, it brings this moment of reflection for them and how they want to continue to be in relationship to others.
Right.
There's just so much reflection and self-awareness that it gets added into this relational transition.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought up just the topic of death. I do think that those in their 20s oftentimes are inevitably experiencing the death of a grandparent, or sometimes tragically a close friend or a younger family member. And so this disrupts the relational dynamics, and they have to ask deeper questions. And so I think you're absolutely right. So there's a lot going on there. We are relational beings. That's really, really true. But I think this idea that young adults are free agents and they're just kind of doing their thing and they don't care about anybody else is absolutely not true. They care deeply about their families of origin. They care deeply about their friendships. Some are better than others. It's not always beautiful, but it has this effect on who they are becoming, what they maybe want to avoid, what they want to step into. And oftentimes that's a lonely place for young adults as they're on the move, oftentimes trying to negotiate their lives in a part of the country that isn't where their family of origin is as well. So that has an effect.
Another thing that might be helpful for youth leaders to think about in this transition is that young adults are very open to therapy or to seeing professionals. And sometimes in the space of therapy is where they can think about and wrestle with and process their relationships. And so, I think I say that, or I bring that up to say that it's okay to tell a young adult, I don't think I'm capable of helping you with this. But I think this is something I will continue to pray with you. I will continue to follow up with you. But I think this is something that we should think about going to a professional too.
I really love that. I think at times as ministry people, we can think that we're responsible for it all. And I do think our job is to accompany young adults. But I do think you're right to know when to say, hey, you know what? I think it'd be great for you to talk with someone as a professional, which is really, really great and important. It's interesting. I think one more thing, young adults oftentimes feel a tremendous amount of shame associated with disrupted relationships. And I've had conversations with a number of young adults, especially here at Fuller, where they'll say things to me like, you would have thought I would have had this figured out by now. My relationship with my father, or something in my family, or with a friendship. And as I've had these conversations, and maybe this is a ministry tip, I've just said to them, well, why do you think you needed to have it solved before now? Maybe you're finally at a point where you can actually reflect on it to get the support you need, counseling or otherwise. Maybe you're right on time in this moment. And I'll tell you something, for a lot of young adults, this is just, you can see their shoulders drop a little bit and they're a little more relaxed rather than thinking, well, I should have anticipated this relational distress or whatever. Going, no, you're finally at a point where you're able to address it. So address it now and don't be ashamed about it, right?
If anything, that self-awareness is really good, especially at such a young age, because as you said, we're relational beings.
Right.
There are adults, there are grandparents who are still having relationship issues with other. So we never get to the finish line. We never become perfect at it, okay?
Yeah. We never get it. We're always working at it.
Yes, we're always working. We're always evolving in our relationships and learning from them and becoming healthier in them.
Absolutely. And I think this is the beautiful thing about young adulthood. I think if we can be aware of that and address it now, maybe this generation is better at that than others, we can develop habits and lay healthy tracks for the future. So, we're not in our 50s wrestling with some things that perhaps we could have maybe addressed earlier if we had the help that we needed, which makes all of you so important, like in what you do.
Yes. Well, that's all we have today for the Relating Transition wrap-up conversation. Remember to hit that like, to subscribe, to hit the notification button so that you can know all about, these transitions that young adults are going through and any other episodes that we're going to drop for this season and in the future. Thank you so much for being with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.
Catch ya.
This podcast is one of the many free resources produced by the Fuller Youth Institute. And speaking of free resources, if you're really liking the content that you're hearing in the season, we want to hook you up with a really helpful resource. It's a guide titled 7 Things You Need to Know for Successful Young Adult Ministry. This guide covers the transitions that we're talking about in the season, but it also gives you practical questions to help you engage young adults. You can download this guide at youngadultministrynext.com. Lastly, Remember that you can watch this episode on the Fuller Youth Institute YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening or watching.